I absolutely love accessibility. I like the combination of taking some technology, looking at the guidelines, and considering as many people's needs. And it's a challenge sometimes because depending on the specific technology there can be constraints. But for me, that is what makes it exciting. And when you get it right, you end up with a system that is better for everyone. There are legal and social reasons to ensure solutions are accessible, which we will come to. But accessibility makes a real difference. For example, I was working with a colleague who is blind. We were both sent a research paper to read in preparation for a meeting. For various reasons, I often get my software to read information to me. But as soon as I tried to do that, I found that while you could select the text, and visually it was fine, however, when you used software to read the text, all the letters of the document were concatenated. So, all the assistive technology was getting was one very long string of characters. While it took me longer, I could at least read it, but my colleague couldn't. It's a simple example, and one which we worked around in the end. But the fact that a document wasn't accessible meant more time and resources were needed, and the employee could be less independent. I have many more examples, particularly of trying to access text so that it can be read to me, both in documents and on websites. But there is far more to making websites accessible than just text. For a long time, I didn't have the hand function and upper body strength that I have today. I didn't have the control to use a traditional mouse. Drop-down menus, when not accessible, are a nightmare, because you need good control over the mouse for them to work. They are also often, especially in the early days, are not keyboard accessible. This meant I could physically not use the website. One of my greatest accessibility issues that I have personally found to be a real barrier for a long time was with banking. Now I appreciate that with any financial system there is the added complexity of security. However, that for me created an issue, because they chose to rely on you calling them to complete certain tasks. This is a real challenge for me. When I raised this with the banking institution, the typical response I got was I should use a TTY, or teletypewriter service. This requires a device that enables you to type to make phone calls to people who use regular phones. If you are deaf, you may have access to such a system, but as I can hear, I didn't, and I didn't want to buy more assistive technology, simply to interact with my bank. I did manage to get into some focus groups for a very large high street bank, and while it took years, they have now developed their systems in such a way that this, thankfully, is no longer an issue. For me, this issue in particular highlights the importance of having a greater understanding into what accessibility truly means in practice. There is certainly more awareness and legal frameworks around accessibility now. And things are definitely a lot better than they were about 10 years ago. However, I do think there is, what I think of as, the, let's just add alt tags, mentality, and we've ticked the accessibility box. But it's when the website or system is used by people, that often it becomes quickly apparent that more thought, insight and understanding is needed. I sometimes explain it this way: it's not the wheelchair that makes me disabled, it's the stairs. Apart from the ethical and legal reasons, to ensure that whatever you are building is accessible, it just makes good business sense. Typically, systems that are accessible are more interoperable and tend to scale more easily between platforms. A recent survey by the Department for Work and Pensions indicated that 24% of the total population of the UK have a disability. Do you really want to be excluding approximately 16 million people? At least some of those 16 million are potential customers, clients or employees. Firstly, a disclaimer. I am a tech guy, and not a legal person, so forgive me for anything I have wrong. In the UK, the legal requirements for accessibility are primarily outlined in the Equality Act 2010. This legislation prohibits discrimination on the grounds of disability and requires public sector bodies and private sector businesses with over 250 employees to make reasonable adjustments to their services, goods, and facilities to ensure that disabled people have equal opportunities. And this has already been tested in the courts too, with several very large and well-known organizations being sued, each of which were found to have breached the Equality Act 2010 and ordered to pay damages. There are additional accessibility requirements that are enforced depending on the sector. For instance, in 2018 the UK government passed legislation which stated that all public sector websites and mobile applications needed to be made accessible. In brief, you need to meet the W3C's Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG for short. These are a list of criteria your website or mobile application need to meet in order to be compliant. Until the end of October 2024, you were required to meet the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines version 2.1 to level AA. However, as of the 1st of November 2024, that is now version 2.2, also to at least level AA. In the private sector at the moment within the UK, the accessibility requirements aren't as prescriptive. However, as all the organizations that were legally challenged will testify, not ensuring your systems are accessible leaves you liable. If you are operating within the EU, you are required to comply with the European Accessibility Act. It is stated that enforcement actions will begin in 2025. Like I said, I'm not a legal person, but speaking as a technical person, my advice would be to aim to meet the WCAG 2.2 guidelines. That will provide you with a solid base to meet the legislative requirements. While all this legislation exists, and can perhaps seem intimidating, as a person with a disability, and a technical person, I can't help but feel, why wouldn't you want to build websites and applications that are accessible? Even if you forget the social responsibilities for a moment, those 16 million people with a disability have an estimated spending power of £275 billion per year. It's a bit dated now, but in 2019 ClickAway conducted some research and estimated that business lost out on £17 billion due to accessibility issues. For me, you know what the epitome of a good and accessible design is. When something just works without you needing to think or work around the limitation. It becomes so seamless that you almost don't notice how good it is. That's hard to do. A good example of this is facial recognition to unlock your phone. It just makes a seemingly simple task effortless, and even more so if you have a disability. It removes a layer of complexity while maintaining the level of security that entering a passcode has. I obviously can't talk about this without relating it to the technology I use. For most people, technology is a convenience, and at times a source of frustration. However, for me, I could not function without it. When I had my first laptop, My father used the money he inherited to pay for it and all the software I needed. I remember the feeling of utter distress when the laptop started overheating, knowing that we wouldn't be able to afford another one. That intense fear of if my laptop fails, I lose my voice. A while ago I was talking to someone and saying, technology is part of me, it's how I connect to people, to the world, enabling me to function and contribute. It has truly enabled me to live the life I do. It also took on a new importance when my son was born. Sebastian had a difficult start to life. But out of that emerged one of the most cherished memories, when in a moment of serenity, in stark contrast to the trauma we had all just been through, I got to sit next to the incubator in neonatal intensive care. I got my phone out and said, "Hello, Sebastian." I proceeded to read him one of the stories I had programmed into my software that I would read to him before he was born. There, in the early hours of the morning, Sebastian and I were holding hands and looking at each other. I was sure he smiled at me too. Technology has evolved so much that the real-time text recognition that is now built into iOS means I can open my communication app, select scan text, and read him a storybook. It's not perfect, I'll admit, but it means I can pick up almost any book and read it to him in real time. These days websites tend to be a lot more accessible. I generally think websites fall into one of three categories. Those where no thought or effort was put into accessibility. Those when you can see they made a concerted effort, perhaps without really understanding what accessibility is. It's fading now, but a typical sign of these websites would be an accessibility toolbar. And then you get those that are truly accessible. And usually for the average user it wouldn't be obvious that it is accessible. The BBC's website is a really good example of this.